It was Solomon who said, "Better is the end of the thing than the beginning thereof." I'm not going to disagree with scriptures, but I want to tell you, Solomon never got to preach in a gospel meeting. And I have just loved this, and it just gets better, doesn't it? I mean, I know this is not a good word to use. One of the preachers in New Zealand says the gospel is designed to make a bad man good and a good man gooder. And I just think the gospel meeting gets gooder and gooder the longer it goes. And what a great joy it's been, and what a debt I owe to so many of you for all that has made this week so special for me, and for Judah, at least the part of the time that she was able to come to services. And it's just been so wonderful. First of all, I want to thank you for the invitation. When I guess Brian's the one who might have mentioned my name first to anyone, and you were crazy enough to listen to him and to take his advice. And thank you, Brian, for making that happen. And thank you, the leadership of this congregation, for having confidence in Brian, and for the absolute unbelievable reception that I've received here. It's been a long time since I preached in a meeting where everyone, I want to say especially young people, listen like those young people have listened during this gospel meeting. And that means so much to me. Sometimes people in services, sometimes they seem like they're not interested. And last night when I was standing here, I looked right at some of you, and I knew you were listening. I knew you were a part of everything that was going on, and that has meant so much to me. I believe I've got it turned on, do I not? No. Well, I'll throw it back over the other way. Is it on now? Maybe the battery's not on. I know what's on. The on and off switch is not on, okay? And that's my bad, because I know who turned it off last night, okay? I know the Bible. You ready? I know the Bible is true, and Solomon never preached at a gospel meeting. We won't go through all of that. You may have heard that, but seriously, thank you all for the way that you've listened, and what a great blessing it has meant. And the way that you have received us has been something that is just absolutely, truly remarkable, and I will remember this meeting for a long, long time. I want to say something about those sister congregations. And so we have some visitors from other congregations tonight. Guys, you've got to keep this up. The attitude that is in this part of the country is just astounding. It is unique in its very nature. And I just stand amazed. I think what you said, we had 15 to 16 congregations represented here one night. And sometimes you go to another congregation in a big city, and if they have 3 or 4 other congregations to come, it's an unusual kind of thing. And so it's just so uplifting to come in, and all of that is just really, really great. And thank you for good singing. It will not mean anything to those of you who are not here Monday night, but this has been some of the most outrageous singing that we've ever had at any time, and we really are thankful for it. And finally, I hope you guys know how blessed you are to have Brian and Lisa with you. There's something about this family and something about their influence on the folks in this congregation. It is remarkable, and it's just been a joy just to see their influence and the way that you received them, and the way that they were outgoing and a part of being a part of this congregation. And you better hang on to this guy for a long time, and his wife, because they are a great, great treat, and you are so very, very blessed. Now let's get to the lesson. A loving God and an eternal heaven. My, oh my. One of the sermons that was preached in the denominational world years before there ever was an individual like Billy Graham was. There was a preacher, and I believe it was in London, that preached about an angry God dangling sinners over the fires of hell. We don't have a lot of sermons about hell and about the reality of hell. I still preach a lot of sermons. But sometimes, instead of doing that, I choose to end the gospel meeting, instead of talking about an eternal hell, to talk about an eternal heaven. I need to say up front, I have no idea what it will be like. The Lord opens the curtains just briefly every now and then to let us have a glimpse of what it's like. But you and I need to understand that it is not God's plan for us to have a heaven here on this earth. I understand and fully agree that marriage is the vestibule of heaven. It's the foyer into heaven. Godly Christian marriages are a foretaste of what divinity must be like. And I fully understand that in heaven we neither marry nor are we given in marriage. The Bible says that we will be as the angels of God. But you and I need to understand the reality of the fact that someday we will be in heaven. And the we that is in heaven is the we that is on this earth right now. Sometimes people say, will we know each other in heaven? You ever see a television program where somebody has amnesia? You know, the kind of program when somebody has some traumatic event or in a car wreck or something, and they cannot remember anything at all about their past. We had a lady who was having surgery on her skull. Hopefully they would not have to get inside the skull to repair the damaging of the growth that was there. But the doctor said, if I have to get down inside the skull, the part of that brain that is there is your memory. And she says, don't take that away from me. That is who I am. I want you to think about that. We shall be in heaven. And we who know each other on this earth, and we'll show some scriptures that really emphasize this in a moment, we shall know each other there. Otherwise, we are like that individual with amnesia. All of a sudden, we wake up in a new world and we have no remembrance at all of anything that has happened in the past. Imagine a man having amnesia, no remembrance at all of anything in the past, and imagine that man being in hell forever and ever, tormented in the burning fires of hell, and he has no remembrance of what it was like on this earth. The man that is on the earth is not the man that is in hell, because the man that is on the earth, as far as memory is concerned, ceases to be. And there is an entity that is there in hell. You remember the rich man in Luke chapter 16? You remember what Abraham said to that rich man, Lazarus being comforted? Did the rich man know Lazarus? And I recognize they're not in the eternal abode, but they're far beyond the doors of death, and they're far beyond that situation. And he saw Lazarus, and he knew who Lazarus was. He even knew who Abraham was. He called Abraham by name. That's remarkable in and of itself. And Abraham says to that rich man, son, remember. And then talks about his life. He talks about the riches the rich man had, and about the poverty that poor Lazarus had endured. You know what that rich man beyond death remembered? He remembered that he had brothers. He remembered how many brothers he had. And he remembered the spirituality or lack of spirituality of those 5 brothers And Abraham said to a man beyond death, Son, remember. Isn't that remarkable? You see, death is not the end of a person. In the book of Matthew, chapter 22, they came to Jesus and they asked him about the resurrection of the dead. Matthew chapter 22, it's the Sadducees who came and said to Jesus, and they did not even believe in the resurrection, but they had a story, perhaps a true story, that starts in verse 23 of that chapter, of a woman who had had 5 husbands. Now that came about because the Old Testament law said that a man married to a woman, God intended for them to have children, to keep that land inside that family, but that husband died before he could have children. And the law of Moses says, let his brother take him and let him raise up children, and those children will receive the heritage that belonged to their father. A second brother died, a third brother died, a fourth brother died, a fifth brother died, a sixth brother. You know, if I'd been brother number 6 or 7, I'd said, somebody better check how that woman's cooking. Something's wrong happening in this house. And they had a question. In the resurrection, whose wife will she, or who will be her husband? Whose wife will she be? You cannot answer that. Isn't it Jesus said, he answers it all. He said, you do err because you do not know first thing, the power of God. God can take care of even those questions where we may not have every answer to absolutely everything. God can take care of every one of those things. And so you need to understand, you do err not knowing the scriptures. Well, what verse in the Bible would show that there is a resurrection? Jesus went to an amazing place whenever he said, at the burning bush, God said, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. You know what he did not say? I was the God of Abraham. We talk about those who are deceased. We talk about our parents, and they were born, and they worked past tense at such and such a place. And we lived past tense. But when God looks at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at the burning bush, God said, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, and God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Isn't that remarkable? I am the God of Abraham. That's the transfiguration. You remember Jesus being there, but there, guess who else is there? Moses and Elijah. They're still alive. I don't know how Peter and Aunt Peter, James and John recognized Moses and Elijah, but they knew who they were. They're on the Mount of Transfiguration. And then hear Jesus say in Matthew chapter 8 and verse 11, that many shall come from the east and the west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Who's going to be there? Many who come from the east and the west. And when they arrive at the kingdom of heaven, when they arrive at that place, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will be there, and they will sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Isn't it remarkable that if beyond death we don't remember anything? If that's true, God could not make a promise that he's made to mankind. Jesus says, whoever confesses me before men. You know the rest of that verse? I will confess before the Father. Have you ever confessed Jesus as the Son of God? We've talked a lot about faith and repentance and baptism, and when we've talked about that, we've said, if you'll let us know that you believe Jesus is the Son of God, we can baptize you. That's biblical. The man said, here's water. What hinders me to be baptized? And the preacher said, if you believe, you can. He said, I believe Jesus is the Son of God. And when he made that confession, wait a minute. You made that confession too, did you not? Do you remember? Do you remember when you perhaps were being baptized, if it were in a public assembly, somebody asked you, do you believe with all of your heart that Jesus is the Son of God? You know what you did? You said, I do. And Jesus says, because you have made that confession, I will confess you before the Father. If you've never confessed that you believe Jesus is the Son of God, then that promise is not yours. But if you'll make that confession tonight and become a Christian tonight, someday Jesus will stand before the Father, and as you stood before men and said, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus will stand before the Father and say, and I believe, and put your name in that sentence, I believe that he or she is one of your children. Let him or her come into heaven. That's my brother. That's my sister. Lord, I confess to you, that is one of your children. And if you've never done that, why would you not do it tonight? There is that promise of those events. You and I sometimes do not fully understand everything that is involved in relationship to this. You want to talk about memory? You want to talk about memory at the judgment day? Who's going to be? Well, we're going to be there. And in Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 30 and 31, there are the sheep and the goats, one on the right hand and one on the left hand. And he said to those on the right hand, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was sick, I was naked, I was in prison, and you did these things for me. And they said, Lord, when did we do this? And they said, when you did it to the least of these, my brethren. You know what that means? On the day of judgment, they had a remembrance of all that they had done and how they had treated the most insignificant person in the church. They had that memory. And so there is that knowledge that we have beyond the grave. I'm not sure of everything that is involved, but I want to talk to you and in the latter part of this lesson about the beauties of heaven. Before I do that, I want to borrow your imagination. I've done that in various lessons, and I'm not going to be nearly ask you to do it as much tonight as we did with Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and as we did with me reading 30 times something and you were keeping count last night. But I want to borrow your imagination. And I want you to have a realization of just how much those who have believed in God have suffered. Christianity may not always be the easy life that we have. We live in a time and an age and in a country where it is relatively easy to be a believer in Jesus. It's not always been that way. The church had no sooner begun until all of a sudden Peter and John are in prison. Why? Because they've been preaching. And the saints have assembled and they're concerned about Peter and about John, and they're praying. Peter and John. You look in Acts chapter 8, that first incident is in Acts chapter 4, but in Acts chapter 12, James has been put to death. And Peter is again, for the third time in the book of Acts, is for the third time or fourth time, I guess, under arrest in the book of Acts, and he is being kept in prison because James has just died and Peter is going to be killed right after Passover, right after Easter. That's two of the three great leaders in the church, Peter, James, and John. Imagine you've given it all up and you've become a child of God. Stephen is then put to death, and great persecution arose. And I want you to imagine being one of those early Christians. It's been wonderful. They were praising God and having favor with all of the people. The Lord added to the church daily those that was being saved. That's Acts 2. You get to Acts 4, and the number that's 4 or 5, the number of the disciple is 5,000 men. Can you imagine the church having 5,000 members of men in such a short time? And then that number is multiplied. It's not addition. Multiply is not just adding 4,000 or 5,000 to 5,000. You understand? It's multiplying that number. Could you multiply it by 3? Could you multiply it by 4? You take your own number and multiply it, but whatever number you comes up will likely be tens of thousands of New Testament Christians, and then persecution breaks out. And in Acts chapter 8, Saul, the Apostle Paul, we know him later, he is out destroying Christians. He is so zealous that he's traveling to Damascus 133 miles away. He hates Christians so much that he'll travel however long it took in that first century world to go 133 miles to find Christians there and to bring them back. And Paul says later, and I was consenting unto their death. He was going to stand either before them or before others and testify against them and cause Christians to be put to death. Imagine you're one of, let me have your imagination. Imagine it's you. Imagine it's the church leaders that you know that have been put in prison, and some have already been put to death. And then in Acts chapter 8, verse 4 says that they that were scattered abroad whenever we're preaching the word, but Saul, Acts chapter 9, verse 1 and 2, was making havoc of the church, entering into the houses and dragging out men and women to kill them. I thought it was easy to be a Christian. Did not Jesus say, a man's enemies shall be those of his own house? I've come to set mother or parents against children and children against children, brothers against brothers, and a man's enemies shall be those of his own household. Can you imagine you being a New Testament church and some individual, some relative of yours, some close friends of yours, in order to gain popularity or to escape persecution themselves, points to your house and says, go to their house, and Saul comes in and he knocks on that door and he drags those Christians out. I'm sorry I forget the name of that individual that was killed by those policemen. Was it 6 months ago? Kicking that young man. He was on the ground. You remember how they were kicking him and how they were destroying him. And the thing that came to my mind as I saw the very policemen themselves beating that individual up and mistreating him, and other policemen standing and watching, I thought, that's exactly the way it was in the first century. It's not easy to be a Christian. If you decide to be a Christian tonight, I want you to understand, you'll have to be determined to stand up and stand for right, because it's always right to do right, and you'll stand up for that which is right regardless of what your friends will do. You may not be the most popular individual in school, because you will not go to the parties that everybody else goes to, and you will not set aside your systems of righteousness in order that you might gain popularity. But that's nothing. That's nothing to compare to how they suffered in the first century. Paul writes 2 Corinthians. He writes 2 Corinthians before Acts chapter 20, or about at that period of time. Paul lived many years after this, but I just want to read to you what Paul himself, who was the persecutor of the church, I want to read to you what he endured and all of the things that he endured for the cause of Christ. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he said, from the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes. And then he says, except one. Can you imagine? We see a policeman take his baton and he starts beating an individual and we think, isn't that cruel? Can you imagine what it would be like? Imagine that burly individual having that rod, and Paul could count every time they began to hit him, and they would hit him and they would hit him. Do you understand? Paul says 5 times that happened to me. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Then he says, once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day have I been in the deep. Then he continues to say, in journeyings often, in perils of the waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of mine own countrymen, in perils of the heathen, the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness often, and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and in thirst, in fasting, in cold and in nakedness. Paul, tell me what it's like to be a child of God. And when I read this, and I read that verse, yea, and all that live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. You really suffered? Maybe somebody said, don't you ever talk to me about Jesus. You may have lost your job because you wouldn't compromise the principles. But that's not persecution like Paul's writing about. I'm talking about boys and girls seeing their mamas and daddies drug out of the house. In secular history, we read of those times when there were believers, when the church would be assembled in a meeting house, and they would come and they would board up all the doors and windows if they had windows, and they would set the building on fire while the members of the church prayed together, knowing that they'd all soon be dead. I've not suffered. And neither have you. And yet Paul says, Romans chapter 8, verse 16, the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glories that shall be revealed. How much in the 70 years you have on this earth, how does that 70 or 80 years you might live on this earth compare to eternity? Blink your eyes. That's about how long 70 years would compare to 1,000,000 years. You will not sing it, brother? When we've been there 10,000 years. Why you go to the dentist? You know, when you get there, he's got a needle that's this big. He's going to get to the other side of the room. He's going to say, "Open your mouth, here I come." He's going to slam that, and then it's going to get one of these air hammer, jackhammers. Is that what you call them? And he's going to get up on this tie stool, and he's going to take that jackhammer, and he's going to mess around inside your mouth. You know why You do that because there's hope. By the way, there's no hope in hell. Across the gates of hell should be written these words, leave all hope here. What about heaven? What about those things that await us on the other side? You know all that matters? 2 words. Well done. 3 words. You've been faithful. And the promise, be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. The Bible talks about the individual who runs the race, and at the end of running that race, he's given a garland crown. Paul says, there's laid up for me the crown of life, which the Lord will give me in that day, and not to me only, but to all of those, that's us, who love his appearing. Imagine on the day of judgment, when every secret thing will be brought into judgment. I remember as a boy, here in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 14, everything you ever done will be brought into judgment. And I thought, I am in big trouble. My mama and my daddy's going to find out what I've been up to. Wait a minute. What about good things? Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you. So persecuted the prophets that were before you. Rejoice. Great is your reward in heaven. As insignificant a thing in one day in your life, and an event happened that you may have never known that it happened, an event happened in your life in which you gave a cup of cold water. And you've done that. And into the day of judgment, God will remember all of those cups of cold water. Remember all those church casseroles you cooked? Remember wiping down the tables? You understand what I'm talking about? You remember somebody being sick, and you remember going over there and you mowed their lawn because you weren't able to get out there. Remember that time you loaned your car to somebody else? You remember that time that you sat down and wrote a card to some individual, and you were not the only one. You remember that time that you signed your name back there on that visitation of the shut-in. And every one of those acts, every one of those events will be remembered. God never forgets. And if God remembers every idle word that men speak, how much better will He remember the good words that we speak? Let me tell you this. There are individuals that you've impacted that you may never know you've impacted. I'm talking to you ladies about teaching these children up and down these hallways. I don't remember her name. I remember going up at the West Huntsville congregation in Huntsville, Alabama. We didn't even have classrooms. We had one big auditorium, and little kids would go in this class, a little bit older kid, or not this class, in this corner, and a group here, and a group here. And it was sort of chaos and everything. And I remember she had a card that had a Bible story. Anybody remember those little Bible cards? They were about, what, 3 inches by 2.5 inches, had a picture on the one side and a Bible story, and she didn't have all of this paraphernalia and all of the stuff that we've got to teach. And she'd sit there and she'd open up the Bible and she'd hold up that one little card and she'd tell a Bible story. And I remember how much I loved Bible stories because of some sisters whose name I do not remember is partially responsible for the love that I have for every one of those Bible stories. And I don't remember who she is. God does. And out of that West Huntsville congregation, 22 young men came to be preachers. Is that remarkable? Nobody remembers all of the teachers. Nobody remembers the events, but it was an atmosphere, and everybody in the church was involved in it. You and I need to understand God's going to remember all of those things. And so when your enemy is hungry, you feed him. If he's thirsty, you give him something to drink. You bless them that curse you. You pray for them that despitefully use you, when every part of the fleshly side of you said, I'd give anything on earth if I could just smack him back. I know enough of dirt about him or about her. I could blacken that person's character forever, and you chose not to do that. And God remembers it. That young man gets up and he leads a prayer. He's terrified. Some godless sister comes and said, you did such an amazingly wonderful, good job. I tell young men that I'm around because nobody's encouraging young men to be preachers anymore. I shake that little boy's hand and, Mark, I'm going to pretend that you're a little boy. You're coming out, and my eyes get down here, and I said, how are you doing? Whoa! You shake hands just like a preacher. Have you ever thought about being a preacher? No. Let me give you 3 reasons you ought to preach. Number 1, it's a whole lot easier to stand up there and holler than it is to sit out there and be hollered at. Number 2, you get to decide when everybody eats lunch. And number 3, you get paid money to go to heaven. Number 4, you get to tell people about Jesus who do not know about Jesus. That's what heaven's going to be like. There may be people in your life that on that day you'll look at them and they will look at you. You're both on the right hand. And they say to you, I'm in heaven because of you. I was your neighbor for all of those years, and you went out of your way to invite me. Thank you for opening the doors of heaven. What's heaven going to be like? I don't know. A brother that I deeply respect says, you know what I'm going to do when I get to heaven? For the first 1,000,000 years, I'm going to walk around that place with the biggest smile on my face anybody's ever had. Yeah. Why? It's rest for the weary. Hark the gentle voice of Jesus calling. I'll give you rest. There's the ultimate rest. There's the reward that is ours. We toil and we labor and we labor and we enter into that rest, And there is the reward. You've been faithful over a few things. And that's all it takes. What is heaven going to be like? No sickness, no death, no sorrows, no goodbye, an eternity of bliss. What's it going to be like? I think about those saints that I've known who've impacted my life. I think about godly preachers who impacted my life when I was just a neophyte preacher, and they said words with me I'll never ever forget. I'll carry them with me to my grave. Not necessarily preachers sometimes. There were others who encouraged me. They're on the other side. And I didn't have a chance to tell them how much I appreciated them. And I don't know if in heaven, I just want to be there, and I want you to be there. There's nothing I want anymore than to think that someday we could all be in heaven together without the loss of a single one. That's what it's going to be like. What's heaven going to be? Perhaps above every other thing, as I think about those awaiting me there, I want to see Jesus. I don't know if he'll have the nail prints in his hands, but how beautiful those nail prints will be if he does. That's why I'm there. I want to be with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I want to be with David. I want to be with Daniel. I want to be with Moses. I want to be with Elijah and Elisha. And I want to be with the unheralded characters that are in the Bible. Because I've known some of those unheralded characters in every congregation that I've ever been a part of. And I can hardly wait. Sing the wondrous love of Jesus. When we all get to heaven. That's all that matters. You talk about knowing each other in heaven. People talk about, well, what about those that are in hell? I'll let God take care of that. He has the power to make all of that happen. If you're a little child and everything's going wrong at school, and you really didn't clean up your room, and it looks like when Mom and Dad have found out about the latest thing you're doing, you're going to be grounded for the next 6 months of your life, and all of a sudden, you're in Disney. None of that matters. There are times in which we are so ecstatically happy that we forget about all the problems that are on this earth. And I trust God. I trust God. The joy and the bliss of endlessly being with all of the redeemed throughout all of the ages, and to be among the sheep who hear the words, "Come ye and inherit the kingdom of my Father." What about you? Do you have that hope of heaven? Do you believe he's the Son of God? Then why would you not this very night repent? Make up your mind. This is the night I'm going to be baptized. And when you let us know you believe in Jesus, he can baptize you. And you'll remember this day the rest of your life. I have 2 birthdays. One is July the 24th, my physical birth. The other is June the 1st, and that is when I was born again. Are you thinking about obeying the gospel tonight? Then tonight ought to be the night you step forward to come and become a Christian. if you're a wayward Christian, I want you to be in heaven forever and ever with all the redeemed. If we can help you go to heaven in any way, won't you let it be known by coming to the front right now as together we stand and sing.